time then, welcome to my book corner. This is my overdue review of the Aule Stratagem Book Two-Aurora by David Clegg. Thanks once again to David for providing me a copy of this one to review. And if you want to check out my review of Book 1, it is up there. As always, we shall take a look at the story, characters, world building and presentation before my final thoughts at the end of the video. Let's dive straight in. It's really hard to talk about the story of this one without spoiling stuff, so this is very much going to be a broad strokes discussion at this point. This is very much a continuation of Book 1, which may seem like a weird thing to say, but bear with me and I'll touch on that in presentation later on. Well, this does kick off exactly where Book 1 ends, with the beginning of the engagement between the pirate frigate Corvus and our hero ship, the light cruiser from the Confederacy, the Aurora. And as remembered from the end of that book, the aim for the Aurora was to gain information on where the pirates were staging from. And first things first here is the way this initially plays out is really, really interesting to me because it's very atypical of what you would normally see in a sci-fi plot, allowing for a number of points of character building, character arcs for a number of the characters, especially on the pirate frigate, as well as reinforcing some of the ethos of the Confederation as well, and also showing the teamwork of the crew of the Aurora and how much they are growing and how competent they are as a group, which I really appreciated. Now, needless to say, the book doesn't end there. They do get the information that they need eventually. And then that leads to the next stage, the escalation of threat, so to speak, as they now need to go and deal with this staging ground for the pirates. And to that end, a task force is put together and sent off to deal with this. There's another couple of subplots playing off there, but I don't want to spoil what they are. But the battle group goes off to deal with the threat of this staging ground, and I'm not going to touch on the story past that. This does feel like a complete story, however, with a natural culmination to a number of character arcs going on here. And what I really appreciate is how kind of passive and background the world building is, but in a way that is show not tell. This isn't an exposition dump of world building here. It's shown in the actions of the characters, and I really appreciate that. And this is, especially when taken as part of a whole with Book 1, a very, very strong military space sci-fi story. The character work here continues to be very, very good, with again characters arcs being driven by actions rather than exposition in a lot of ways. Be that from Cara Tayley, with them showing creativity and a knack for leadership in difficult situations, to Commander Patterson's continued growth as the XO on the Aurora. And there's an interesting mirroring here of how Commander Patterson's sort of journey goes and his predecessor as XO and how that ended, with one event particularly towards the end of the book that feels almost point for point the same, but the outcome is different. And I wonder how much of that is down to the fact that he has a different military background coming from a marine family, but also learning from the former XO's mistakes and also not being in the job long enough to gain any level of complacency. An interesting thing to consider. The character that kind of got the most for me, though, was the commander of the frigate, which was Captain Coate, who had a number of standout moments here, especially early on when the engagement was beginning. This is a character that is strategically very, very, very shrewd and can read the battlefield well and knows when a fight can be won and lost and can see where the points of escape potentially can be. And I really appreciated that. This is a competent leader, kind of in opposition to some of the other pirate leaders. And what's really interesting here as well is how strictly Coate sticks to his beliefs. And this comes up a number of times throughout. He doesn't see himself as a member of the Confederation. He doesn't see himself as subject to their rules. Their rules don't apply to him. He doesn't recognize them. He's not a member of them. And that sticks all the way through to his end in this, his part of the story when it finishes. And that's really interesting because it gives him a moral framework that some of the other pirate characters don't actually have. Also, you have an interesting interaction here between the head of the pirates as well, Captain Locke, and the Imperial representative who's kind of overseeing this clandestine event. Marcus Crassus, I think it's pronounced. And you don't get the same sense of moral certainty from either of those characters, and that's really interesting. You very much have a bag of rats sort of mentality between the two, between the pirates and the Imperials on that side of things, and that's really interesting to look at. Overall, the character work is, again, really, really good, and I can't say too much here without spoiling things. I like the way that you have a continued development of the relationships between the characters, especially with Patterson and the rest of the crew of the Aurora. And also Patterson and Cara Tayley as well. That's really, really well done. And all the characters go through their arc and they come to a natural culmination for this story, which again makes this feel complete, but potentially something that you can then spring off from in the future. As I mentioned before, all the world building in here is very passive. It's shown by characters' actions. And there's a number of different things at play here. You have, for example, the work around Cott and his belief in his own cause and his belief in the Imperials. And you have this interesting thing of utter belief against each other's ideals, which is really fascinating to show the difference in the ideals between the Imperials and the Confederation in particular. And as mentioned previously, the initial way the fight plays out between the Aurora and the Corvus does a really, really good job of showing, first off, how the crew is gelling together on the Aurora with the recent changes, but also the sort of governing philosophies of the Confederacy, and that plays out throughout the story with this very civilized approach to so many things. But what's really interesting with this as well is that when you then go after the sort of staging ground for the pirates, you have something that doesn't come up very often in sci-fi, and that is the logistics of battle. What do I mean by that? So you have these ships which have a limited amount of munitions on board, a limited amount of supplies, and when they find the place they're looking for, it is better defended than they potentially expected. And given time, they could probably win. But there's a cost to that. And there's also a limited amount of munitions that they've got at this point. And there's no guarantee that they necessarily have enough munitions or time to take it down on their own. And this shows then some creative thinking from the crew of the Aurora specifically, which is really, really well done as character moments for them. But also shows kind of an underestimation by the Confederacy, which is something that leans into some things in Book 1, where there's been this resistance against an increase on military spending, this sort of blindness to a threat that is building. And this does a good job of showing that sort of apathy, I suppose, might be the word. It's certainly not incompetence, but a sort of lack of appetite for the military at this point in time in this universe for the Confederacy. And this is kind of the end result. It's kind of slightly under-resourced in some regards. And it's only creative thinking that allows them to get to the point that they need to get to, which is really, really well done. And again, you have the constant reinforcement of the ideals, the repetition in the dialogue that continues to build this as a military setting. And also worth mentioning, is the makeup as well of the sort of the force that they send off after this staging ground. It's very reminiscent of how strike groups operate today, with a big, powerful battleship potentially taking the place of what you potentially use as an aircraft carrier nowadays, with gunships and frigates to act as screens, basically, and then a couple of smaller sort of capital ships with the light cruisers to kind of accentuate things and add the middle ground with slightly more targeted offense rather than quite as bombastic as the battleship is. And it's really interesting to see how that plays out with this kind of war of attrition, which I really, really appreciate. And also, you get a good look as well at the legal system of the Confederacy as well, and the relationship between the Imperials and the pirates is shown as well, although not in any great detail. But this is very much a marriage of convenience from the Imperials' point of view, and they're willing to just cut and run when things get sticky because they don't want to have any, well, they don't want to get caught, basically. Really, really well done. I do love passive world building like this. It makes it feel so much more alive, and I think it's really well done. Presentation then, and this might sound like a criticism, and it's not meant as one. This didn't read as most 2-book series I've read do, in that, generally speaking, a duology will be made up of 2 books, and there'll be an arc for book 1 and an arc for book 2. This has one arc really over the course of both. While you do have mini arcs in there, the culmination of the arc overall does come at the end of book 2. You're still on the journey in book 1. And generally speaking, you'll have a culmination in book 1 and then a restart of another arc in book 2 and then an ending in book 2. This felt more like a TV 2-parter. Now, I did mention this in my review for book 1. There's a lot of inspirations here from sci-fi TV, from Doctor Who, Star Trek, Babylon 5, Battlestar Galactica. There's also smatterings of Star Wars in here, but I'm leaning more into the films for that rather than the TV shows. And when I started reading this, I could hear Marshall Roddenberry's voice in my head going, and now the conclusion, in the computer voice that she did for the 2-parters. And that's how this feels like it's structured overall for the 2 books. It feels structured in a similar way to Best of Both Worlds from Star Trek The Next Generation, which was the second Borg story. Which is exceptional, by the way. You should definitely go and watch it if you haven't. I just find it quite interesting because you don't see many books that actually do things that way. And it does start you off potentially with a bang in this one. And what I will say is the pacing of this is quite up and down in a way that really, really does work. Where you have these high moments of tension, but then it dips. But even in those dips, you're having these character moments and this sort of passive world building that still keeps your interest and keeps the plot rumbling along before it moves to the next peak and the next moment of battle tension, for want of a better word. Once again, this is exceptionally well written. The use of repetition is also really well done here, once again, driving home the idea of the military efficiency and everyone knowing their place. And then that facilitates, once again, moments where they kind of break a little bit from the book and allow these individual moments of character brilliance, which are the pivotal points of the plot as well. And they work really, really well. Overall, I need to take both of these as one rather than individuals. But I think this does prove to be a very, very good part 2. And does conclude the character arcs that were set up in part 1 whilst building on the world and building on the dynamics. Final thoughts then. This continues to build on the foundations set down in book 1, continuing the character arcs to a natural conclusion that is more than satisfactory in the way it ends. You have some really good organic world building, you have some interesting use of repetition to build that world as well, and you have some twists and turns in here to keep you guessing also. Overall, I gave this 4 stars, and I think if you take it as a pair, then actually this raises the pair put together to 4.5. I do wonder if this would have worked better for me if it was one book rather than two split up. I think I prefer this kind of structuring in other media personally, but I absolutely think you should go out and buy both of these if you are a fan of military sci-fi or space opera in general. I think there is a lot to like here, and I really do hope that David at some point revisits this universe as well. But that's it from me. Have you read any military sci-fi or space opera that you've really enjoyed? If you have, let me know in the comments down below. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you very soon.